Hello, this is Dr. B, your nerdy criminal justice professor, with a video on risk assessment in criminal justice. In this video, we're going to address risk assessment because it's important to correctional programming in the sense that correctional programming is based on classification. Risk assessment is a way of objectively classifying inmates based on the likelihood that they will continue to commit crimes once they are released, as well as the likelihood that they fall within a particular population of offenders. That's why it's important to talk about risk assessment. So let's jump into this brief tutorial about risk assessment itself. Risk assessment is used on the outside as well by probation and parole, um, agencies such as day report centers and home confinement. So it's an important topic just across the board in corrections. As a professional counselor, licensed professional counselor, and expert on sex offenders, I have used risk assessment in pre-sentencing evaluations of sexual offenders. That's why this is such an important topic. So what is risk assessment exactly? Well, it's important that we understand the difference between actuarial risk assessment versus clinical judgment. Now, when we say clinical judgment in this context, we don't always mean just judgment from a licensed clinician, but this can mean the judgment of any criminal justice professional as to whether someone is a risk of continuing to commit more crimes. Actuarial risk assessment means that we look at items that are specifically known to relate to the risk of committing more crimes. It's not my gut feeling in actuarial risk assessment. It is non-emotional things. So let's think about this. In insurance, especially car insurance for our purposes, let's think about actuarial tables. I'm 62 years old. If I were to try to get car insurance on, let's say, a silver BMW, and no, I don't make the kind of money to drive a BMW. But let's say that I tried to get insurance on a silver BMW. At 62 years old, the insurance would be based on the fact that 62-year-olds who drive BMWs don't tend to get into accidents. But it would also be based on the fact that a BMW is worth more. So the insurance for the BMW would be much higher than, let's say, I was trying to get insurance on a silver Toyota. We're not talking about the quality of the car, we're talking about the determined value of them. Now, let's say that I am a 17-year-old boy and my daddy just bought me a red Corvette. My insurance premiums are going to be very, very high. Why? Because through insurance actuarial tables, we know that teenage boys who drive red sports cars have the most number of accidents. It's just actuarials. There's no emotion involved in this other than the insurance companies hate losing money. That's the only emotion. So they simply look at who costs them more money. And those folks pay higher premiums, which makes sense, right? It evens out. If you're going to cost the insurance company more money, you're going to be paying them more money for your insurance. That's actuarial risk assessment. So that's what we try to do within the field of risk assessment in the criminal justice system. Andrews and Bonta, and the most recent version of their book was published in 2023, developed what is called the RNR principle. That stands for Risk Needs Responsivity. So there are two different types of actuarial risk factors. There are static factors. Static, try to think of static cling, things clinging together. They stay put. They don't change much. For our purposes, the static factors are things that cannot change through our effort, through our intervention. They might change, but they just automatically change. And I'll get to that in just a second. So treatment isn't going to change them. Very important to understand that. Now, some static factors can get worse, but they cannot get better. And here's the clincher. We've got more robust research on the static factors than we do on the dynamic factors or the needs. So static factors are things that it's pointless to treat because treatment can't change them, or at least cannot make them better. So let's think about what some of those are. One static factor is age. At 62 years old, let's say I was a career criminal, but I'm 62 years old. That static factor, because of my age now, would mean that I am at lower risk of continuing to commit crime than if I were 25 years old and I had begun committing crime when I was 15. There is something about age that lowers risk. So, but that's a static factor. Treatment can't change that. So another static factor that can get worse but not better, in other words, treatment can't fix it, cannot make it better, is criminal history. The more previous crimes I've committed, the higher risk I am to commit more crimes. I cannot go back and undo the number of crimes I've committed. Even if I get them expunged from my record, I still committed them. They're still there. So those are static risk factors. Now, dynamic risk factors, what are called needs in Andrews and Bonta's research, are factors that we can address through treatment. That's why they call them needs, because these are the treatment needs. These are the things that we can target in rehabilitation to hopefully reduce risk. Now, we know if these factors are present, then the individual's at higher risk. If they're not present, they're at lower risk. But the question is, if we treat them to make them better, does that improve or lower the risk level for that individual for likelihood of committing more crime? So these are things that treatment can change. So we focus our rehabilitation efforts on them. Now they can get worse. They can get better. But here's the thing, there's not as strong of research support on the dynamic factors or the needs as there are on the static factors or the risk factors. Now, here's the other thing. We don't know from research if improving them through treatment actually does lower risk. We've not actually done the research of doing the treatment and then seeing if it lowers the risk. Now, the third element of this are what we call responsivity factors. These are things that either enhance or impede responding to treatment efforts of the dynamic needs. And there are several of them, but I'm going to just cover a couple of them. One is intellectual deficits. Someone who has intellectual deficits finds it harder to understand treatment, harder to understand what we're doing in treatment. And so that might interfere with their ability to respond to treatment. Now, another responsivity factor is antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy. It's important to understand that psychopaths or people with antisocial personality disorder have a pretty strong understanding of the pain that they're causing. They just don't care. um, I know a lot of folks don't like me putting it quite that way, but that is the truth. Um, we know that folks with antisocial personality disorder don't get better with treatment in general. What they do is, as we do therapy with them, psychotherapy with them, they're learning more of the ins and outs of psychotherapy and they learn how to manipulate better rather than getting over their antisocial personality disorder. I read a study some years ago that found that the only thing that curbs the criminal behavior of an antisocial personality disorder individual is paying them not to commit crime. But there are ethical issues involved in paying someone to not commit crime simply because they have antisocial personality disorder. It's important to understand these three different types of factors. So we've got the static factors, things that we can't treat. They're just not treatable things. Um, but these are more valid. We have the dynamic needs, things that we can treat, and they still have some pretty strong validity to them, but nowhere near as strong as the static factors. But we don't know if we treat them if it actually does reduce that individual's likelihood of committing more crime. And then we have the responsivity factors that we really don't have research on yet. Okay, so let's look at each one of these. So let's try to figure out which one is which. So can you identify which criminological theory relates to the factor as well? Andrews and Bonta, The Psychology of Criminal Conduct, when you go through their book, you start to realize a lot of these factors are related to the different criminological theories. If you haven't had the course yet, I hope that you can remember Andrews and Bonta's stuff and think about it. Okay. So criminal history, would this be static or dynamic? Okay, if you said static, you're right, because you cannot make better the criminal history. You can make it worse. So let's say I'm evaluating somebody today and they have 5 armed robbery convictions, 5 separate armed robbery convictions, and they have a breaking and entering conviction completely separate from those. So they have 6 different conviction dates. So we've got that. But then 10 years from now, I evaluate that same person again and they've added to their criminal history. So they've made it worse, but they can't have made it better at that point. Okay, education and employment. So would this be static, dynamic, or a responsivity factor? Now, if you said dynamic, you would be correct because you can add to your education. You can improve your employment history. All of these things are improvable. Family and marital relationships. If you said dynamic, you would be accurate. You can improve family and marital relationships. Now, some things you may not be able to improve for under this particular thing. For example, for sex offenders, if they have a strong marital relationship, that is actually that actually lowers their risk of committing another offense. If they have a weak marital relationship, that can increase their likelihood. So treatment can actually improve the marital relationship, reducing the likelihood of reoffense. Now, that's one part of family marital relationships. Another part, do you have any criminal family members? specifically parents or siblings. If you have criminal parents or siblings, that's not changing. So that would be static. So this one carries with it some static and some dynamic subfactors. Leisure and recreational pursuits. Yes, you can change those. You can improve those. So these are dynamic. Companions. Differential association theory. Okay, probably one of the most studied theories of criminology. Edwin Sutherland, one of the most influential criminologists in the history of the field. We know that if we change our companions to those who hold to definitions that are favorable towards abiding by the law and disfavorable towards breaking the law, we're less likely to commit more crimes. We can change our companions. Alcohol and drug problems. Though rehabilitation for alcohol and drug problems might be a long haul, they can get better. So that's a dynamic factor. Pro-criminal attitude and orientation. We actually can change our thinking. At 62 years old, I can tell you I've changed my thinking a lot, even without wanting to. It's just that age and experience subtly changes the way that I think. And it will do the same for you as well. But we can change our attitudes and our orientations. So this is dynamic. Antisocial pattern. Now, this might take time, but we can change the pattern. So if I have an antisocial pattern over the last 10 years and for the next 6 months I don't, maybe that's not really changed yet. Maybe I'm just faking it to make people think that I've changed. But over years, antisocial pattern can change. And then psychopathic personality disorder. Now, this is an interesting one because in the end, we know that personality disorders don't really respond to treatment like we would like for them to. In fact, getting to a certain age, they start to burn out of the individual, and waiting until they're older, till the individual is older, is likely the best the best treatment. But in the end, psychopathic personality disorders can be treated, theoretically at least. So this is a dynamic, though long-term treatment factor. And then intellectual deficits, this is a responsivity factor. Okay, so what are some of the limits of risk assessment? Well, it's based on research of known recidivists. Well, how do we define recidivism? Do we define it as a new conviction? Do we define it as a new charge, which is a lower threshold than conviction, or do we define it as a new accusation without a charge, which is an even lower threshold? So how are we going to define whether someone has actually done it again in our research? So, and different research studies have different definitions of recidivism. So we have to look at that when we are evaluating those studies and their application to what it is we're trying to use the study for. But now let's also think of the dark figure of crime. Now, hopefully, when you had your Introduction to Criminal Justice course, you learned about the dark figure of crime. So if you remember the crime databases, we've got the Uniform Crime Reports, we've got the National Incident-Based Reporting System, and then we have the National Crime Victimization Survey. Those are the three biggies. The first two are collected from official crime data from police. The second one is collected from individuals who might have been victims of crime. Individuals are just cold called throughout the U.S. and asked about victimization and whether it's been reported or not. So we know from the National Crime Victimization Survey that there are a lot of crimes that don't get reported. Some of the most secretive of crimes that don't get reported are um, intrafamilial abuse. So, intimate partner violence and child sexual abuse are two biggies that don't get reported very much. We have to keep in mind that part of the dark figure of crime, some of those unreported crimes, are likely new crimes. In other words, they're not going to go into any recidivism studies because we don't even know that these new crimes have occurred by individuals who'd already been convicted. So that's very important. And then another limit of risk assessment is it fails to address individual characteristics. See, with research, we're looking at group characteristics. We always are. We always are. So we're failing to address individual characteristics when we apply the R&R model exclusively. So just to kind of sum up, risk assessment can help inform the level of supervision, and it can help identify targets for rehabilitation, but it cannot address the dark figure of recidivism or undetected recidivism. Very important to keep in mind. Now, I'm going to throw in an aside here. Okay, as an expert on sexual offending, and I've done a lot of treatment of sex offenders. So I am a scholar. That is, I'm a professor on the research side of things, but I'm also a practitioner. I'm a therapist who still treats these folks. So, as someone who has a foot in both worlds, sometimes I get frustrated with folks who are purely researchers who will say, well, the recidivism rates of sex offenders are very low. Well, we don't know yet because um, of the dark figure of recidivism, okay, when it comes to sexual abuse. Um, and I know case after case that years later it came out that the offender got out of prison and went right back to offending the victims. But the victims lost their livelihood. They went into poverty while the perpetrator was in prison. So they just didn't report it again because of the negative consequences of being protected by the legal system from the perpetrator. They were worse than the perpetration in their minds. Um, a lot of things that keep true recidivism from coming to light so that we would know about it. So when we try to say, oh, we got to go, we got to do this over here because recidivism rates are low, always remember that in the dark figure of crime, a significant portion of those crimes that we don't know about are recidivist crimes. So we have to understand that we cannot have a hard and fast recidivism rates are low. No, we can say to the best of our ability, based on the research that we know, understanding that some recidivist crimes don't get reported, it appears that recidivism rates are low. So when we get cocky in saying that they're low, we've really messed up academically in view of scholarship, well, and as scholars and as criminal justice professionals. All righty. Well, this video has been a little longer than I would like for it to have been. But I want to thank you all for bearing with me through the video. Now I'm going to stop the screen share. So now you can see my face. Um, I don't know if you can see, I've got the Alpha Phi Sigma logo right here. I don't know if Appalachian State has an Alpha Phi Sigma chapter, but for those of you with high GPAs, 3.3 overall, 3.2 criminal justice classes, you would qualify to be in the Honor Society. So you might look into getting Appalachian State to start a chapter if you don't have one already. All right. Well, I will see you next video, and I hope that you came to an understanding of what risk assessment can be and what it can't be at least on the surface, by watching this video. And we'll see you next time.